Okay, so last we left off, we talked about the straight line sprint tests and how we would go about doing those and the various forms of those sprint tests. Next, we have we would head into a balance test, right? So there are 3 stance positions: double leg stance with feet together, single leg stance, as well as tandem stance where the dominant foot is in front of the non-dominant foot. And the test can be conducted on a firm surface as well as a soft surface. Okay, the stances are held for about 20 seconds with eyes closed for each condition, hands on hips. Athletes are told to stay as steady as possible. If they lose balance, they attempt to regain their initial position as quickly as possible. Some of the errors you would look for in this type of a balance test would be opening the eyes, lifting hands from the hips, touch down of non-stance foot, step hop, or other movement, lifting forefoot or heel, moving hip into more than 30 degrees of hip flexion, remaining out of position more than 5 seconds. Okay, so those are things that would be an error in the testing. Now, what are some athletes that really need a lot of balance? I can think of a few. I mean, you have dancers, you have competitive cheering that needs balance. You also need football players need balance, tennis players need balance. So you're wondering who would actually benefit from this type of testing as well. I want you to think of that as we go through these tests. Okay, so for example, this would be a firm example on a hard floor, and going from this feet together stance to the tandem stance. And then as well as this would be on a soft surface application, right? So this is going to provide a little bit more instability. So for an athlete who is progressing or is a bit more advanced, you would test them also on a soft surface, not a hard surface that doesn't give as much feedback. Okay. So then there's something that's called the Star Excursion Balance Test that we would go through that I want you to read about, as well as then we're going to head into some flexibility stuff. So this is our starting position, which sit and reach is our most common flexibility test and gives a good overall indication. So again, I want you to be creative with whoever is doing, these type of tests. You can use a ruler, you can measure it out, use a tape measure to demonstrate these tests. Just be as creative as possible in your videos. The overhead squat, right? So this is a good detailed position. As you can see here, it's very important when you talk about your evaluation test to talk about body position and the correct body position one should be in. Do you see how he's looking straight ahead and he's maintaining that lumbar curve in the back? That is what he wants, what we want to maintain, right? And then he is still looking straight ahead. If he tipped his head downwards, we're going to lose that lumbar curve. And what's going to happen is it's going to put pressure on the vertebrae posteriorly, which is what we don't want. Okay, and as we all know, we're going to head into some basic body comp data, but skin fold measurements are very common for strength and conditioning coaches to use, as well as a number of different health professions, right? We know how to do this from a multitude of classes, okay? So I'm not going to go through these too quickly, but we have a chest skin fold, a thigh skin fold example, abdomen and triceps, superilium, mid-axilla examples, right? And these are good, it's very, very important to have inter-rater and intra-rater reliability with this test because you can find a great amount of error in how you gather up the skin. Okay, so common sites for girth measurements are chest, upper arm, forearm, waist, hips, thigh, calf. This is a review for all of you. These are common girth measurements right up here. Okay, so when we talk about statistical evaluation of test data, you know all of this from your research methods and statistics class, but now that's important to apply those concepts to classes such as this. So our 3 major points of central tendency are mean, median, mode. Mean meaning the average, median the most middle score when the scores are arranged in an order, and a mode is the one that occurs with the greatest frequency. Descriptive statistics continued. We have variability, range, so the interval from the lowest to the highest score, standard deviation, a measure of the variability of a test score is about the mean. Right, so we all know these definitions for the most part, but what is important to know is what is the range? So when you're talking about an athlete, who has the best score, and then you see what the lowest score is. And then when you add them and do all of these statistical analyses together, you'll get a standard deviation to see where that normal bell curve is. So who's on the lower end and then who is on the higher end. If you care sometimes about more performance and you look at data, you would look at who's in the middle towards performing in that higher end, who's that outlier there. Okay, and then we have percentile rank, which is a percentage of test takers scoring below an individual. Okay, so here's our normal bell curve, right, that we look for scores, right? So it's important if someone's an outlier over here compared to someone who's performing here, but then the majority will perform somewhere in here, right? So this could give you a good indication of preparedness and readiness for physical activity. Okay, inferential statistics allows one to draw a general conclusion about a population from an informed collected population sample, and a population sample must be representative of the population you are testing at hand. So for example, if you wanted to test the VO2, the VO2 variable with soccer players, but then you tested ballet dancers, that is not going, and you got a majority of athletes who were ballet dancers to football players, is that going to give you your answer? No, not so much. You want to go test the population that you are looking to find answers about. So you would gather soccer players to do your testing. Okay, magnitude statistics allows for interpretation of the clinical significance. A smallest worthwhile change, the ability of a test to detect the smallest practically important change in performance. And of course, the effect size is a statistic used for calculating group performance following a training program or comparing between groups of athletes, right? So we can now compare. Okay, so when we talk about developing the athletic profile, we want to select tests that will measure the specific parameters most closely related to the characteristics of the sport or sports in question, right? So this is going to relate all to that assignment that I was talking about. You want to select, so part 2 of that assignment is selecting 5 evaluation tests that are going to help answer your question of the sport or sport in question. So choose valid and reliable tests for these parameters and arrange the testing battery in appropriate order. If you want to look at appropriate order for a testing battery, look at the previous lecture and to see why you would want to test in a certain order. It's all based off of metabolic and physical demands, so you get the best performance out of the athlete testing in that specific order. And administer the test battery to as many athletes as possible. So that's going to give you a holistic view of the people either trying out for the sport or where your team's at in general for strength, endurance, and different modes of training. So for example, if you're a strength coach and you are coaching an athlete of 30 players on a team and then 20 players on another team and then 25 players on another team, it's important per team to test as many of the athletes as possible to give you your baseline data of where you are and where you need to start out with your programming. Okay, compare normal data when appropriate and repeat testing when you can, right? So you don't want to just test them at the beginning. You want to sometimes test a few times to see the progress of your programming. If you don't do any retesting, how are you going to tell if your programming is correct? Do you need to make any changes? Do you need to increase the intensity? Do you need to back off the intensity a little bit? Or are you right on track with where you had planned? So that's important to do repeat testing. Then identify the strengths and weaknesses of the athletes and design the training program with those in mind, right? So you want to make notes of both of those. So this kind of makes sense, right? So on their weaknesses, you might need to spend a little bit more time on, and their strength, you might need to still continue to develop. However, you may need to not focus so much on those areas compared to the other areas which need large amounts of improvement. Okay, all right, so that is a brief overview of the testing, administering and scoring of test PowerPoint, right? So I went over some of the tests, but a lot of these tests I want you guys you're going to be the ones diving in and explaining thoroughly and within videos as well as your papers regarding the 5 evaluation tests to your athletes. I will be posting all of those so everyone can share and see those eventually. But that is the testing and administration portion of this, and that will wrap up this section, and we will go from there. All right, thanks everyone.